Hi, we are group number 4 and we are going to discuss about the problem between mobility apps and taxis. The public problem that we are going to discuss is the inequalities between taxi drivers and mobility app drivers that makes it really difficult for users to choose between the both services. The main actors are taxi drivers and mobility apps drivers. The main difference between these two services is that the taxi drivers have to pay a quota to be able to drive the car, and this quota they pay it to the taxi enterprises, and they also have to pay two type of insurances, one for the passenger and the other one for the car. And then mobility apps are mostly in form of apps, and they take like 30% of the ride. And also these drivers only have to be adults, have to have a SOAT, a valid driver's license. Then the other main actors are the users, the government that has had a lot of different types of policies to help this problem, and also the taxi enterprises. The main activities are transporting, security, and setting competitive prices, because this is a huge factor in this conflict. For the first part of the context, it is really important to say that since the arrival of Uber in 2013, taxi drivers and taxi agencies have been against it. This made that in 2015, Uber to be sanctioned for 451 million Colombian pesos for violating public transport regulations. And still these days Uber is considered illegal, and taxi drivers keep thriving for the departure of this type of app. In 2019, Uber is ordered to cease operations. However, thanks to a law, they still managed to keep operating. And in this year, a lot of other competitors in terms of mobility apps came to the play, like Didi and Pickup. And then taxi drivers this year in February made a march and make a stop on the road of the El Dorado airport, asking for the cut of this illegal service. For the user insights, we use both the affinity diagram and the empathy maps, and we found this. First, that both services can exist since the demand is significant. Also, the government has postponed a decision on support the mobility apps, and it is increasingly having more pressure for taxi drivers to not legalize it. Then many want the same terms for mobility apps and taxi drivers. Finally, mobility apps should not disappear, since they create many jobs for Colombians and are an excellent option for many users. Also, they both need to improve the payment methods and avoid accepting just one for the personal benefit of the service provider, like try to avoid using muñecos to fix a higher starting price. Also, sometimes the decision of which service to take depends on the tariff and the user's location. That is all related about the dynamic tariff and everything. Then taxi companies should invest in better training for the labor force, because a lot of the participants said that in the inside taxis they don't feel as comfortable than they feel in a mobility app car. And finally, that the participants are divided. A lot of participants don't use mobility apps because they are informed about the conflict between taxis, and they are not. They want the mobility apps to legalize, to start using them comfortably, and the ones that use mobility apps still, if they still know that it is illegal, it's because of terms of security and the experience.
Now, to contextualize the previous attempts for the Colombian government to solve these problems, we will tell you two types of intervention that have been made. The first was approached from a legislative perspective with the law of 1753 of 2015, where they established the rules for automobile land transportation services, including those granted by the platforms. On the other hand, from a financial perspective, they began to impose fines on private vehicles that provided these transportation services, giving way to the immobilization of cars. But this measure only generated partial fear and insecurity because the vehicles found a way to prevent these types of fines. Colombia has promoted dialogue between both parties since 2019, however, they have not been able to reach an agreement. We can learn from other countries because public transportation is all over the world. In terms of worldwide interventions, we studied the case of the United Kingdom and Spain. In the UK, they took the measure on the formal side. From 2021, they granted the title of formal workers to the drivers of mobility apps, such as Uber. In this way, they provided them the rights to a minimum wage, paid vacation, and a possibility of retirement. On the other hand, Spain tried to apply a limit of BTC licenses for every 30 cab licenses and requests to companies regarding communicate their routes before performing them to keep the jobs of taxi drivers safe and limit the operation of mobility apps.
Although many cities around the world face the same problem, Bogota's case is really different. On the first place, we have that Bogota's insecurity is a great issue. On the second, that the public transport infrastructure is really bad and it is not enough for the demand. On the third, that there is a cultural bias against taxis, not only seen as bad drivers but also as bad people. On the fourth, that in other cities around the world, taxi service is seen as a VIP or premium service, meanwhile in Bogota not. On the fifth, that the trust in institution is shattered, there is no legitimacy from the government. And finally, that as Colombia, Bogota's labor market is characterized for its high informality. All this investigation that we did led us to the final value proposal that we wanted to address, that consists in leveling the mobility markets field and making it competitive by taking off extra fees taxis mandatorily pay. However, before that, even though we already had defined the problem, the real question was how to attack that problem. That's why we had an internal group discussion upon it was better to address security, which was the main user concern, by improving the taxi service and making it more competitive, or address a public policy that would directly affect and change regulations in order to level the field between taxi drivers and mobility app drivers.
In the later stage, we proposed a solution regarding security, trying to solve the issue with technology in terms of an app. However, we were not able to reach a consensus as a group, so we suggested another proposal much better to what we wanted. We used some specific value questions regarding relation to the previous insights, the level of impact, the level of innovation, and the easiness to apply the solution. The question that differentiated public policy from the creation of an application were about its levels of impact and innovation. A public policy will have a huge impact on this issue because it changed the rules of the game that taxi drivers are tired of playing. As I said before, our first attempt of solution was regarding security towards passengers. We suggested a government made up for taxi drivers to make an effort to balance the opportunities for taxi drivers against mobility apps. However, we quickly decided to rule it out because many mobility apps already offer taxi services, and in many areas of Colombia, technology means a barrier for these actors. We also didn't find ethic to put the information depending on the government because they could use all this data in dangerous ways. So, to resume our journey throughout the problem, we mainly found support in interviews. We interviewed many people since the beginning of this work until the application of the prototype. All this purpose of the problem to find a value proposal were based on multiple design thinking methods like empathy maths, approach to previous interventions, and analysis of the results to understand what went wrong. Moreover, our constant discussion as a group also proposed different points of view regarding the solution, to finally select the most appropriate and efficient one based on our topic.
Our proposal consists on eliminating the quota system that regulates taxi drivers. Since it would be unfair because a lot of them have already made a very important investment, we also plan on making a fund financed by the 3% of all the services that mobility apps make. Regarding the time, we plan on extending the period of the elimination of the system in 6 months, and the idea is that the fund would take place until all of the compensations to the taxi drivers are made. Our proposal is mainly directed at taxi drivers, but it would also have a very important impact in other agents, such as mobility app drivers because of the fund, app users, also taxi companies and particular quota owners, and the idea is that it would be implemented by the government, more specifically the Ministry of Transport. Regarding the place, the when, since it is a public policy, the idea is that it takes place in the Senate and the Congress, and we plan on taking this as a sort of pilot in Bogota, and later on, if it works, applying it in other major cities where the quota system operates.
Our final prototype was a public policy that tried to involve these principal actors: taxi drivers, mobility app drivers, taxi company owners, and app users. They were also part of the interviewing process to test the prototype. We thought that directing a whole document of a public policy would be something very difficult to evaluate. So we summarized the main consequences of the public policy and communicated them to the general public through a press release issued by the Ministerio de Transporte and Ministerio de Justicia. The key topics were the elimination of the quota that taxi drivers have to pay in order to operate in the city, and the implementation of a fund to compensate those cab drivers who have already paid for it.
For our prototype, we first interviewed Pedro, who has been working as a taxi driver for 17 years. He gave us some interesting insights about hypothetically removing the cupos. These are some quotes of his interview. And for example, an important quote is that he said, "There is a problem with Colombian law, and we cannot make the public private nor the private something public. So it's really important to mark that difference between the public service and the private service." Also, he talks about the importance of the quota to make the city less congested. From our interview with Mr. Pedro, we got 5 key insights. The first one is that it's unconstitutional to remove the cupo because it would be necessary to change the national constitution. Second is that mobility app drivers do not provide a public service, so it's important to mark the difference. Third is that the cupo was made to avoid too much taxis around the city, but the mobility app drivers are doing exactly that. Fourth is that apps improve a lot of the experience for taxi drivers too, not just for users and mobility app drivers. And fifth is necessary to avoid monopoly like what happened with Transmilenio and SATP. Second, for our prototype, we interviewed Mr. Jorge and Mr. Andres, two mobility app drivers. These are some quotes of the interview with Mr. Jorge. And it's important to remark some things. For example, that he doesn't think that he is providing a public service because he's using the mobility app. Also, that he would like to contribute to pension and healthcare. And also he remarks the safety issues of the passengers, but also the good conditions of the cars. So from both of these interviews, we got 8 key insights. The first one is that for Mr. Andres, the service provided is public, but not for Mr. Jorge. Second is that the mobility apps might not be cost effective for the drivers. Third is that the good conditions of the cars can be assured through the service surveys of the passengers. Then is that it's preferred to use the mobility app for both parts. Also that formalizing the job of the mobility app drivers is really important for Mr. Jorge, and he thinks that also the government does not care. Then avoid the monopoly like what happened with Transmilenio and SATP. And last is that removing the cupo will not fix the problem.
The interviews shared some of the thoughts regarding the problematic. Here we can see some of the quotes on the mobility app user. First of all, the one about I only use mobility apps because it's much easier since I always pay with a card. It tells us that there's a problem regarding the safety in paying methods of the taxi. Second of all, well, taxis are not safe, and even though mobility apps have problems regarding safety, at least you can complain. Well, this also tells us about the importance that the user sees in the security of the means of transport. And most importantly, in this thoughts, I don't really see a difference regarding quality of service between mobility apps and taxis. So the only key differentiator is the price and the fact that you can complain about the service. On the other hand, there's another thought of the interviewee that its reliability and prices, knowing how much I'm going to pay for the service beforehand, is really important because sometimes taxis charge much more. This is important because it's part of the service. There's like differentiator in price, in how the price change can affect the user's decision. As per the insights and conclusions of the interviews from the mobility app users, first of all, safety and convenience really are what drives the preference for mobility apps. And there's a higher perceived safety in choosing the service of mobility apps. And also there's convenience with the of payment method of cards, of credit cards and debit cards. So there's an obvious lead in the individuals to favor mobility apps over taxis. Also, really important is the lack of clear complaint mechanism undermines trust in taxis. So there is a way you can complain about the service of a taxi, but the public doesn't really know what are the means to complain about these services. On the other hand, mobility apps really offer the perceived advantage of safety and of the ability to complain, and they do believe they have a voice in the platform in the service. Lastly, in talking about differences in service, the reliability of knowing the cost of a service is a huge differentiator. And taxis are often criticized because you don't really know if you actually go to a place you need to go, and if the driver will actually take you. And they're often criticized again for inconsistent pricing practices, that you can't really see what's the price they're going to charge you beforehand. Mobility apps do have a perceived preference because they offer a transparent and clear price before the trip, and so there's a confidence factor associated with the financial aspect of the service. On the other hand, taxi user thoughts are seen here. First of all, I only use mobility apps when it's really urgent and I can't get a taxi, and this will be interesting because of the rest of the quotes. It's easier to get a taxi on the street, and usually I don't have to wait that much for an empty taxi to go by, so it's much more immediate, as it is said there. And there lies the importance of the difference in the actual difference in services. Another important aspect is seen in this quote: I'd rather help taxi drivers by using their service than using illegal service, even though I'm not against mobility apps. So there's ethics involved, which is also very, very interesting and will be seen in the insights after this. Lastly, regarding the actual law we're talking about, I think that the quota should be eliminated, but taxi owners should not get that money back since it was already spent. So it's the opinion of a taxi user regarding the quota of the taxis, of the taxi drivers and taxi owners. And it's also said that the policy should take effect next year, as to not disturb this year's economic processes. Most important insights regarding taxi users is the payment preference and convenience. So a lot of people don't really like to use credit cards and debit cards and prefer to pay in cash. So that's the primary factor of deciding over taxis over mobility apps. Also, some people really don't know how to use mobility apps, and they still only use taxis. They call to the taxi service, and the taxi service arrives, but they don't really know how to use the mobility apps, which is really important aspect of the usage of taxis. Also, for taxi users, there's a limitation associated with the mobility apps. So in certain situations, such as a higher demand for the mobility app drivers, it's really impossible for users to find a driver. The other hand is the positive perception of taxi fare accuracy. That is only based on the personal experience of the users. But they don't really have encountered instances where they are like overcharged by taxi drivers. So there's a trust and satisfaction associated with a personal experience. So that's the other important aspect. Users really or insights are really dependent on the user experience. There's also the support for legal taxi services. As I said before, some people really tend to use taxis just because there are ethics involved. And mobility apps are illegal, and they don't really find themselves choosing an illegal service over a legal one, which really only highlights a preference for like upholding the legal framework and supporting the livelihoods of the traffic. These are the insights of the user interviews. First of all, it's competition. We decide to summarize it as competition because there's a really important aspect that should be taken into account, and it's that mobility apps and taxis should be competitive, and that's what the users think about, and that saving money is more important in competition. That's how the service is really provided. So people prioritize the cheapest option, whether it's a taxi or a mobility app. But of course, mobility apps can provide a cheaper service due to the lack of regulations. So it's a really important aspect to take into account. On the other hand, is about the policy we're talking about. That's eliminating the quotas, but users talk about the gradual elimination of the quotas. But there is a suggestion to not remove the quota, but not to give it away again to the taxis. But there's also the importance of a gradual transition towards the elimination and the implementation of the mobility apps in the cities in the country, and regarding the policy change. All of this for the smoother implementation of this policy. So there's no trouble.
The last actor that we interviewed was the taxi company owner, which in this case was Oscar from Bucaramanga. In the first place, he talked about that national laws, such as the Constitution, and international treaties, such as the Agenda 2030, made, in fact, the legalization of mobility apps, or our proposal, in fact, not feasible. On the second place, he considered that public transport is a public service that privates were providing with no regulation at all, meanwhile taxis were in fact paying a lot of insurances to at the end protect the user. On the third place, we had this tension between the citizens and the government because many Colombians many years ago made an investment in taxis and they're expecting a revenue that is being affected by this illegal service. So many of these citizens are planning a massive demand against the state. Then we have the stigmatization problem we talked about before, and he considered that this is being promoted by media. Next, we had that in the case of this solution being carried on, the quota payments will take too long, and this will not be fair for the taxi owners. Finally, we had like a reflection upon what is a public service and who should provide a public service. And he made us understand the consequences of, in fact, making legal these mobility apps, which is very important. So let's hear about it.
Entonces, el día de mañana llega cualquier aerolínea, no cumple ningún requisito y va y le hace competencia a Bianca. Solo que tú llegas y contactas a la aerolínea, usuario con piloto y ya. Eso se vuelve una locura, que va a transgredir derechos también del transporte marítimo. Porque el día de mañana van a haber buques que prestan el servicio de transporte de mercaderías sin cumplir los requisitos que hoy día se controlan vía FOB o vía códigos o normas Incoterm, que son las normas internacionales de transporte marítimo. Es decir, el que tiene una cosmovisión más amplia, empieza a ver más allá qué va a suceder. Porque si ya se le permite a un fenómeno incrustarse entre un Estado, otros fenómenos van a alegar el derecho a la igualdad.
These interviews were really helpful, and although we wanted to talk a very specific part of the problem, there are still some lasting problems that we'll not address. The first one is that mobility apps will still remain illegal, and their drivers will still face informal labor consequences. The second one, that mobility app drivers don't contribute to roads maintenance, unlike taxi drivers. And finally, that the users will still face great insecurity problems. On the other hand, we have the challenges that we will face in case that we follow this public policy. The first one is that we don't want to repeat the past mistakes that were made with the public transport system related to buses, in which there also was a quota compensation, but it wasn't fairly paid. Also, that there will be a possible backlash from the users and mobility app drivers to compensate the quotas, as they will have to pay more for each drive. Third, that there will be also a possible backlash from taxi companies as this relation with the quota system will disappear, and the quota compensation will take probably many years. And last but not least, there will be also less car use restrictions that could, of course, worsen the traffic jams that are already a big problem in Bogota.
One of our major findings in the project is that the debate was way broader than we thought. It is not only about discussing whether mobility apps should be legalized or how the taxi drivers should adapt to this whole process, but what is considered a public service, what should be only provided by the government, and what can also be provided particularly, how far should the government go and intervene in the markets, and these sort of questions were all along our whole discussion and make it more difficult for the problem to be solved. Here are some of the conclusions that we were able to draw in our project. First, there were actors that we did not even initially consider but that are very important in the analysis. Second, both mobility and taxi drivers are the ones suffering the consequences the most, even more than users. Third, yes, the debate is very complex when it comes to stating that the government should be the only one providing the transport as a public service. We think that it can also be provided particularly because it is efficient and it benefits the demand, the part of the demand, but it also needs to be regulated by the government, because if not, it sets a precedent for a future unregulated service that can end up in even more problems. Third, Bogota's case is very particular, and the problems that happen here should not be extrapolated into the country or even internationally, so the case is very complex here. And finally, there are some legal, national and international aspects and treaties and laws that represent barriers to some of the solutions that we came up with. Here are some of the things we learned. First, we need to look into the future. There is no way to eliminate progress, and every take and every approach helps solve the problem. The thing is that here we're having a very specific analysis. We're in a very specific case. We are treating the problem very particularly, and it is not going to be solved like that, but different approaches and efforts from different perspectives are going to help. And second, not everybody is going to be satisfied. Every actor's wishes that the solution has a different shape, and it is extremely hard to make a public policy. We think that even more to execute it. And finally, the debate goes way beyond. It is not that simple. It can even turn ontological.